With that, welcome to Herdley Fundamentals. This is the third in a series of webinars talking about Herdley that we've given. My name is Cannon Smith. I'm one of the creators of Herdley. And the other two webinars have been posted on our website at herdley.ca in the webinar section. This one will be recorded and also posted there in the next day or two so that you can rewatch it later on. And just want to let you know we do have another webinar coming up in another 2 weeks, and you can register for that one if you'd like to on our website as well. We're hoping that this will take approximately 90 minutes tonight, maybe not quite that long. And so let's get started. First of all, let's take a quick look at the agenda. This is what we plan to cover tonight. We'll go over some basic list manipulation. We'll talk about filters, then workspaces and actions. And then we want to spend a bit of time on the cattle life cycle from Herdley's point of view. And then we'll talk about dashboards, child lists, show you how to print and export data. We'll show you how to edit certain kinds of things on the phone. We'll go over some CCI integration, and then we'll finish by showing you some documentation and answering any questions that you might have. So with that, let's get started. Let me switch over to Herdley. Okay, so when you launch Herdley on the computer, this is what you'll see. You'll see the dashboard. And I want to start off by clicking on the Animals List button. And this is where we're going to spend a bunch of our time tonight. So I'm just going to resize that window so we can see it a bit better. What I'm going to show next is something we showed in our the first video, and I won't spend very much time on it, but it's just to show how to work with different list items, how to select different items so that you can work with your cattle quicker. So if you want to select an animal, you would just click one of the rows like this. You select another animal, you click that. That's pretty basic. Sometimes you want to work with several animals. And so let's say we wanted to work with this one here all the way down to this row here. If I click the first one and select it, and if I hold the Shift key down while I select the next one, or rather the last one, then Herdley is going to select all of the animals in between there. And then we can do what we want to from there. Sometimes you want to select animals that aren't all in a row like this. And to do that, you can hold down the Control key if you're on Windows, or the Command key if you're on a Mac, and select a row. And that allows you to select additional rows like this. You can also use the same technique to deselect certain rows. So I can just deselect a few rows here. So a combination of doing those things, and in addition to one other one, if you want, you can select just one row, and then if you hit Control A on Windows or Command A on a Mac, you'll be able to select all of the animals that are currently being displayed in the list. And this makes it possible for you to quickly perform actions on lots of different animals at the same time. Okay, the next thing I'd like to go through is filters. Filters are quite fundamental to Herdley. You usually want to work with a certain group of animals, and it's kind of hard to find them in the overall list. Like, let's say you wanted to see all the calves. Well, you could go like this, and you could start selecting all of the calves all the way down, but that would get boring very quickly. And so the thing that can help make that faster is a filter. So I want to show you just a few filters. The way to get to the filters is by clicking the filter button up here. We'll do that, and that brings up the filter window. Now, by default, the filter is always showing just current animals. If we wanted to show every animal, whether it was already sold or dead or anything, we would choose any, and then we would click Apply Filter, And now you can see that we actually have all 275 animals that are in this ranch are showing. Usually you don't want to see them, and that's why we default to just showing the current animals. Let's go back to show just the current animals. And as you can see down here, even though we have 275 animals on this ranch, only 148 are displayed right now. Now I started talking about how we could select just all the calves. Well, let's do that using a filter. We'll open up the filter window again, and this time we're going to choose in classification calf. And then we're going to click apply filter. And when we do that, you can see that only calves are now showing in this list. There's 67 of them. So if we wanted to perform some action on all of the calves in the list, then that would be a quick way to do that. Remember that if we select one of them and hit Control A or Command A, that automatically selects all of those calves, and then we perform our action. So what else could you use filters for? Well, let's say, for an example, you wanted to record giving calf guard to all of the calves that were in the west pasture. Well, how would we do that? We could go up to the filter first. We already have our classification set to calf. So right now we're looking at all current calves, but let's also change the location to west pasture. Now we have current calves at the west pasture, and if we click apply filter, we'll see that we have just those 4 calves that are in that place. And if I were to select one and then hit Control A or Command A, they'd all be ready to go. I could then click on the Actions button. I could choose New Drug Event. And then if I were to go down, I could enter in calf guard. I could enter in the other information I had, including a dosage. We'll just put 2 units for right now to make it simple. And when I hit save, it actually creates a drug event giving calf guard to all 4 of those calves. Now let's go back to the filter button. And at the bottom of that window, there's a button called Reset Filters. And when we click that, it gets rid of any filters you have, just going back to just current animals. And that's often a really quick way to get back to seeing the animals you want to see. And you'll see that those 4 calves are actually still selected in the list, so we could continue to work with them if we wanted to. Now let's do something that's just a little bit more complicated. We're just nearing the end of calving season for most people right now. And one thing that's common during calving season is you want to have a list of all of the cows that have already calved for this year. So how would we do that? Well, let's click the filter button to bring up the filter window again. We know that we want to look at just cows and just current cows. And so we'll select current, classification equals cows. But the rest of our common filters aren't really going to help us with this particular thing that we're interested in. So what we're going to do is go to the advanced section, and we're going to click the plus button. And one of the fields that we have available to us in Herdly is the date of the last calf. And so that seems like a good field to use to try and find out whether or not an animal is calved yet or not. If the date of the last calf is in this year, she's probably calved in this year. And if it's not, then she wouldn't have. So I'm going to double click that to add that to the list of advanced filters. So you can see the field is date of last calf. Now if I double click the condition cell, you'll see that I've got quite a few options. Herdly knows this is a date field, and so it lets us do a lot of date-related things. Well, in this case, all we really care about is whether or not the calf was born in this year. So we can go to year is, and then the value is just going to be the year, and it defaults to the current year, which is exactly what we want. So when I click apply filter, it's going to show just the cows that have calved in 2019. And in my case, because I haven't been keeping up with my calving in my fake ranch, I only have 4 cows that have calved, but you can see those here. Now, what if we wanted to do exactly the opposite? We wanted to see what cows still needed to calve this year. Well, let's go back to the filter. We want to leave this exactly the same because we're still interested in just cows. Let's go back to the advanced tab. And in this case, really what we want is we just want any cows where the date of their last calf was not in 2019 or was before 2019. So we'll double click that and we're just going to choose year is not. And if I do that and then click apply filter, you'll see that now we have 74 cows. These are all the ones that have not yet calved in this year. Now, we can be a little bit more particular, and depending on how you're entering data in Herdly, you may need to be. I'll just give you an example of that. If I click on the filter button to bring up this window again and go back into advanced, we're looking at any animal that's classified as a cow where the date of the last calf is not 2019. But if we want to be more accurate, maybe we want to make sure we're not including any cows that have been culled but haven't been sold yet. We want to make sure we're only looking at ones that are in the breeding pool. We can actually add as many conditions in this window as we want. So let's add another one to make sure we're looking at only cows that are actually still in the breeding pool right now. So I'm going to click the plus button again to add another condition. And I'm going to just start typing in breeding pool. And here, one of the status fields is breeding pool stage. And that's going to do just nicely for what we want to do. So I'll double click it. It adds it as a new condition. And what we want is for the breeding pool stage to not be removed. Because if an animal's been in the breeding pool, at some point when it's culled or sold or you record a death for it, then it's going to change the breeding pool stage to removed. And so what we're looking for is a cow that isn't removed yet. And then if I click apply filter, in my case, all of the cows, it's going to be the same number of cows, but that would make that filter a little bit more accurate in some cases. So that's a little look at filters. Let's go on, and we've been talking a little bit about the date of the last calf. Maybe you actually want to see that in this list. Let me show you how you can do that. Let's go up and we'll click on the View button. The View button opens up the View window, and on the right-hand side of the View window, we get to see all of the columns that we're currently looking at in the list. And on the left-hand side is all of the fields that are available to be shown. We can just search if we want to get there quicker. So I'm going to start typing in date until I can see date of last calf, and I see it right there. And so I can just grab it and drag it and put it over here somewhere. And now it's going to be in our list. We'll click OK here. And when I do, you can see that date of last calf is showing right where we put it. If I don't like that location, I can actually move it right here. Maybe I want to move it over to the right a little ways, and that's certainly possible. Another thing that I can do is I can sort by this column. So if I click in the column header, it lets me sort, and then I have kind of a rough idea of, we know we're looking at all the cows that haven't yet calved this year, but that are supposed to calve, and we know when they calved last year. That might give us a bit of a rough indication of when they might calve. Of course, there's other fields we can use to be a little bit more accurate with that as well. But let's leave it like that for a minute. Now let me just check to see if there are any questions so far. It looks like we are doing good. Excellent. Now, I want to show how we can use a workspace here. We've set up a filter, we've added a column, we've put it in the right place, we've sorted by this column, And maybe this is something that you want to look at quite often. Well, you can do that by saving it as a workspace, and then you don't have to set it up the next time. So with everything set up, I can click on the Workspace button at the top. And what we want to do is save what's already there as a new workspace. So I'm going to click on Save Current Workspace here, and we're going to give this a name. And so let's call this 2019 cows that haven't calved. And I'll save that. Okay, so that's been saved. Now if we go back to our workspace, and let's say that we were just using the default workspace, we'll switch back to that. And notice that with the default workspace, we lost our column there. If I go into the filter, you'll see that we don't have any of the other filters we had. There's no filters here. Everything's been reset. Now you want to get back really quickly to see which cows haven't calved. The way to do that is to click on Workspace. Here's the one that you just saved. If we double click it, you'll see that instantly it adds a column back in, and it's sorting and filtering to see just the cows that we wanted to see. We can check that by going into the filter button, or in the filter window, and you can see all of this has been added back again. So that can be a very powerful way for you to set up an environment, sort of a saved report, really, a saved live report for you. And whenever you want to switch to different kinds of animals that you want to look at, you can just switch to the workspace as I've shown you there. Now, before we move on any further, I'd like to just switch to the phone. And let me just do that. Just take me a second here to switch. Okay, hopefully you can see my phone right now. I have Herdly running on the phone. And I just want to show you that much of what we've just shown in Herdly on the computer can be done on the phone as well. So currently we're looking at our dashboards here. I'm going to tap the animals button at the bottom. And now we're looking at our list of animals. In the same way that on the computer I can select different animals, I do the same here by simply tapping an animal. If I tap multiple animals, multiple ones will be selected. And this gives me a chance to select a bunch of animals to do something with. At the top left-hand corner of the screen, there's a selection button. And if I tap that, it gives me some extra options here. So for example, on the computer, if I hit Control-A or Command-A to select all of the animals, you can't really do that on a phone, but if you hit Selection and then hit Select All, then that's going to select all of the animals. Similarly, I can deselect all of the animals, and there's a few other options there for that. But what I'd like to show now is the filter. You remember that we had a filter on the computer that would show us all of the calves, or sorry, all of the cows that have already calved. So let's do that one. In the top right-hand corner of the window, there's a filter button, and I'm going to tap that. Now you see that we have a list of common filters, just like on the computer. So I'm going to change the classification by tapping that and setting that to cow. So now we'd be looking at just our current cows, but we need to add that advanced filter. So I'm going to scroll down to the bottom, and you'll see at the very bottom there's a button called Add Advanced Filter. I'm going to tap that, and that brings us to our advanced filter field screen. I'm going to tap the field, and then here we want to find date of last calf. So I'm just going to search for it because it's a little bit quicker to do that than to find it in the list because there's so many fields. And I see it there, so I'm going to tap on date of last calf. Now I need to change the condition by tapping it. And if you remember, we used year is, because we're looking for ones that did calve, and it defaults to 2019. So I tap Done in the top right, and I could add more filters at this point if I wanted, but I'm happy with the way it is, so I'm going to tap Done again. And now you'll see that we're looking at those 4 cows that have already calved in 2019. And so there you have a way on the phone as well to be able to use your filters to quickly find just the animals you want to. And then I could do something with these animals. I could give them a drug, or I could do a preg check, or a mating event, or any of those sorts of things. All right, let me just pause for a minute to see if there's any questions at this point. And it looks like we're doing good that way too. All right, let's switch back to the computer. Just give me one moment while I switch back. Okay, hopefully you're able to see my computer at this point, and I'm still on the animal list there. What I'd like to go through next is some of the actions. Now, I don't plan to go in great detail on every action, but only to give you a sense of how the actions work. And so the basic paradigm in Herdly is that you select one or more animals. Maybe I'll just select a few here for an example. And then you perform an action on those animals. And to do that, you click the Actions button here at the top. This gives us a list of actions that we could perform on these animals. Now notice that some of these actions are available and some of them are disabled. We can't perform certain actions on this particular group. And Herdly is smart enough to know when you can't perform or when it doesn't make sense to perform an action. And there might be times when you wonder, why can't I perform a particular action? And let me show you where you can find what's required for an action. To do that, I'm just going to select one animal, and I'm going to pretend to create a new calf here. I'm not actually going to do it. But if I was curious, I could click the Help button that's available when that action's there. So I'm going to click that, and that opens up in our documentation some information about that particular action. If I scroll down a little bit, every action has a Starting the Action section. And if we go down to the second paragraph, it gives us a bit of information about how we can start the action. And then it explains here, this will only be available if exactly one female is selected. So it just cares that the gender is a female and that there's only one selected. And in that case, it will work. And the other actions have similar information. If I just go out to actions, you can see a list of actions, and each one of them will have a description about that. So if you're ever unsure about why an action is disabled, that's the place where you can find out about that. Okay, so that explains about why they're disabled. Let's go on to the next thing. Just cancel out of that. I just want to show a quick shortcut here. I've been showing how you can click the Actions button to bring up this menu of possible actions. And actually, if you right-click in the list itself, it'll bring up a similar list. And that can be helpful if you're going quickly to find the action you're after. So let's just look at a few actions. One action that doesn't require any animals to be selected is the New Animal action. And so if I choose that, then you'll see that there's some information I can add to create a new animal. And this action is really designed to either bring your existing herd, if you're bringing your herd in when you first start using Herdly, and get them in there, or when you purchase animals in the future, this would be the way to get those animals in there. So you'd give it a tag and whatever other information you wanted here. You would set up the status, including whether or not it was going to be in the breeding pool, if you know the birth date and the breed, the location it's going to be in, Just scroll down here, there's some arrival information, including a price and who you purchased it from and a weight if you have it. And if this animal is going to the breeding pool, you can enter that information here, and the ownership, and even add a photo there if you want. And once that was done, you would click the Save button, and that animal would be added into Herdly. So that's a new animal. A new calf I just showed a moment ago, but let's do that again. To do that, you select the cow that's just had the calf, and then choose New Calf. And this has a different set of information because adding a calf is, of course, a little different than purchasing an animal. Here we know the dam. You can add the foster dam and the sires if you want. You got some calf IDs here, birth information, got some attributes that you want to add. Notice that Herdly's pre-populated the breed field, and it does that based on the dam and the sire. If I were to change the sire, it would change that again with the new information that it had. Of course, there's calving information. There's a note, and you can even add a picture. And once you've done that, then you've brought a new animal into Herdly, which is a calf of the cow that you had selected. So I'm going to cancel out of that. Sometimes you're going to need to edit information about an animal. And to do that, you select the animal, click Actions, and go down to Edit Animal. And that brings up quite a lengthy list of fields that you can change. But really, this is the spot where you can change all kinds of stuff, including making up for errors that you might have had when you entered. So for example, when this calf was born, we would have entered it in using the new calf action, but maybe the vigor score was entered incorrectly. In order to change that, we would edit that animal, go to the vigor score field, and make that change. Notice that there's even information, if I scroll way down here, about the animal's death and about the removal from herd, these kinds of things. I'm going to explain this in a bit more detail in a few minutes, but it's important to realize that if the animal hadn't already died, for example, you wouldn't use this area to record the death. This is only to make changes after the death has been recorded. There's a different action that's actually designed for recording a death. And I'll explain why in a moment, but just keep that in mind for the moment. So I'm going to cancel that. Let me just show a few more actions. There's lots more that you can explore later. Let's say that we wanted to add a new weight for this cow. We have her selected. We could click Actions and choose New Attributes. And in the new attributes, we can actually change a lot of her attributes all at the same time if we wanted. In this case, let's say we just wanted to change the weight. So maybe we just weighed her and found out she's 1,150 pounds. We could do that and hit Save. And now her weight known in Herdly would be 1,150 pounds. And again, you can do that for several animals at the same time. We're just looking at cows right here. So let's go back to our filter. I just want to reset our filters so we're looking at basically all current animals because I want to choose a calf this time. If I choose a calf and go to Actions, oops, let me choose a different calf because I already weaned that one earlier in my testing. So I've chosen a different calf, and again, I could choose lots of calves at the same time, maybe all of the calves from a certain location as an example. And then I choose New Weaning. And I could enter in, all I really need is the date, but if I know the weight and I want to add a note, those things are optional as well. And if I were to save it, that calf is now known to be weaned in Herdly. If you're going to keep back animals for your breeding pool, maybe replacement heifers or your bulls as well, once you decided to do that, you'd want to add them to your breeding pool. So you'd select one or more calves, add to breeding pool is the action you would choose, and you just enter in the date, and if you happen to know the weight, that's great, you can enter that as well. And then that calf becomes part of the breeding pool. Now let me just show one more action. To do this, I'm actually going to select a couple of cows here, and I'll click back on Actions and choose the Move Animals action. You'll see in this action we can choose where we're going to move the animal to and the date and the time, which is pretty normal. There's also a little bit of extra functionality in this action where exposures can be automatically created if things line up correctly. And so if I were to change the location to the bullpen, because I happen to know some bulls are there, you'll see that it's going to tell us that 2 cows will be affected if we leave the automatic exposure checkbox turned on. And what will happen is it'll create 2 exposure events for those cows. I just show you that in preparation to show some information on our website, which helps understand how all of these actions work together. So let's just leave that there for a minute. And I'm going to go down here and open up our website so you can see that. I'm currently in the support area, and I want to spend a bit of time talking about some of the fundamental behind the scenes things that happen in Herdly, where if you understand those, you'll be able to make better use of Herdly. And to start with, I'm going to go into the typical cow life cycle section. Now you'll see here that we have a number of events that typically happen in an animal's life. Here, for example, an animal might be purchased or perhaps born on your ranch. Typically, it's going to later be weaned. If you're going to keep the animal, you might make it into a yearling and eventually keep it as a replacement heifer. After it's kept as a replacement heifer, it goes into the breeding pool. It starts off as open. It will become exposed at some point, hopefully becomes pregnant, and then a new calf is born, becomes open again, and that cycle continues. And then at some point, that animal is either going to be culled or sold or die, and that will need to be recorded. The important thing here is that Herdly has different actions that should be associated with each of those events. So as I mentioned before, it would actually be possible, if you wanted, to use the new animal action to bring a new animal into the herd when it was born. And then you could go into the edit animal and edit a few things and tie it back in with its mother. But this would be the long way of going about that. It's better to use the action that's intended for that. So when a calf is born, rather than using new animal, it's better to use new calf. Why? Well, because Herdly will do some things behind the scenes when that happens. So as an example, if we use new calf at birth, we can scroll down here and we'll see some of the side effects are listed. So when you use a new calf action, there are several things that happen. The calf status will be set to current in most cases, but it also changes a number of pieces of information that Herdly is storing about the mother. For example, the breeding stage automatically gets set to open. It changes the first breeding date and the last breeding date since they no longer apply. The first possible calving date and the last possible calving date as well. It changes the last preg check date to be blank in preparation for the next preg check, and some other information there as well, including closing any open exposure records. So that all comes for free when you use the correct action. And so our recommendation is to try and use the correct action in the correct place. If you're going to wean your animals, rather than going into the edit animal and add the weaning information, use the new weaning action and it will make sure that things happen correctly. This idea of a breeding pool and an animal coming into the breeding pool is also important, as we'll see in a few minutes. And so what we've done here in this life cycle is at each event, we've tried to list the action that makes sense. So when you keep a replacement heifer, you'd want to use the add to breeding herd action in order to do that. In here, when an animal's going from open to exposed, you would normally use the move animals action, which is what we just showed a moment ago with that checkbox checked. And if you do that, this should all happen automatically. You can manually add an exposure or even a mating event when needed. To move from exposed to hopefully pregnant, you'd be using the new preg check action. And then of course the new calf action makes it so that cow becomes open again and you continue the cycle. So I recommend becoming familiar with this part of our documentation. The side effects of each action are listed here, and so you can get an idea of what's going on there. Now while we're here in the documentation, there's a few other things I'd like to show you. I'm just going to scroll back up to the top here and go back to the general part of our documentation. We were just looking at the typical cow life cycle. I want to go into the field descriptions section for a moment. Now, I've mentioned on an earlier webinar that in Herdly we've tried really hard to make it so that you don't have to enter in very much information about each animal if you don't want to. Some people want to enter lots of information, and that's great. We provide all kinds of fields for you to do that. But some people only want to enter basically the least amount possible. And so we tried to find a balance between allowing people to enter as little as possible and yet still be able to take advantage of having lots to report on, having good dashboards that show what's going on in your herd. And so this section explains what fields are actually basically the most important fields to enter. So if you can enter just these, and there's 11 of them, so I'll go through these really quickly. The management tag or the tag, that's important. In fact, you have to enter a tag in for that animal. Even after they're sold or dead, there still needs to be a tag. It doesn't have to be unique. You can reuse tag numbers, but you do have to have a tag number. The status always has to be there. We recommend using the gender field. It isn't necessary, it isn't required, but a lot of calculations and functions are based on what the gender of the animal is, and if Herdly doesn't know that, it'll just skip those animals in those calculations. The birth date is important. If you know the exact birth date, that's better. But even if you just know the year the animal was born in and you choose some random date, like say March 15th as is suggested here. So if you purchase some cows and you know they were all born in 2012, for example, you could enter March 15, 2012 for all those cows. And Herdly will be able to do a lot of things with that information, even if it's not perfectly accurate. So we recommend using that wherever possible. The calving date is the calving year is very important, especially when we're trying to come up with certain dashboards that are related to calving distribution, for example. The wean date, if the animal's been weaned, is important. That's actually the field that Herdly uses to determine if an animal's been weaned or not. So even if you don't know the weight, at least put in the wean date. Similarly, with a yearling date, if you're keeping animals as a yearling. The arrival type is also important. This helps us helps Herdly understand what animals have been raised from birth on your ranch and which ones haven't. And that can affect some of the dashboards as well. For example, it will affect, let's see here, your calving percentage here. A purchased animal that was born in a certain year, of course, shouldn't affect the calving percentage of that year. And so that's how Herdly distinguishes between the two. The breeding pool entry date and exit date help Herdly understand when a cow or a bull was in the breeding herd, which can affect many calculations. And then the breeding pool stage is also important. So those are 11 fields that we strongly recommend that you use in Herdly. If you do that, almost all of the dashboards will be able to calculate correctly. We do have a few other fields or practices that we recommend using. These aren't as critical as those first 11 fields, but those are listed next here. Moving animals, we recommend keeping track of the animals as they move from field to field. And there's a few things that can happen behind the scenes more automatically as a result of that. Exposures and matings where it makes sense, but at least exposures are important. If you're moving animals consistently, then the exposure information basically happens automatically. So you don't need to worry about that. We recommend preg checking your cows and recording the results. That also drives quite a bit of information in Herdly. And finally, weighing your cows and also at least estimating birth weights and weaning weights can be very helpful too. Specifically with the cows, in Herdly, we have several places where we have an adjusted weight or a weight weaning weight ratio, for example, or birth weight ratio, which can provide some interesting data for your ranch and also in helping decide whether or not to keep a cow or to cull her later on. But it's important to know the mother's weight, and we don't want to use a weight that was from a long ways away. And so Herdly tries to find a weight that was within 400 days of whatever the event is. So let's say you have a calf that you're weaning and you've recorded the weight of the calf. In order to find the weaning weight ratio for that calf, Herdly will try and find a weight of the mother that's within 400 days of that day. So essentially just over a year. And if it can find one, then it will be able to calculate that. And if it can't, then it won't. And so we recommend, where possible, to weigh your cows each year, perhaps at preg checking or some other convenient time. So as I said, those practices aren't as necessary as the first 11 fields, but can definitely be helpful. We'll just go down here a little bit further. I don't want to show all of these fields because there's a lot of information here, but just so you can see that each field that is in Herdly is listed in this documentation and with an explanation of what the possible values are in the field, what they mean, whether or not it's required. For example, in status, we can see the 4 possible values are current, dead, sold, and source. And you can see a little bit of information about that. So when you're trying to learn Herdly, trying to figure out what a specific field does, what its values, or how its values might affect other things in Herdly, this is a great page to go. And this includes not only information about the animals, but if I scroll down quickly, additional information that's related to the animals, like exposure events and mating events and preg check and so on. Just going to go back because there's one more page that I want to show here in the documentation before we get back to Herdly. This is actually the next one here. It's called Calculations and Formulas. And if you're ever curious to know how Herdly is calculating something in the background or what formula is being used, this is the page to come to. We've documented exactly what's going on for every calculation, so you can see that. I just want to point out a few of them here. Let's just go down to, I mentioned before that the adjusted birth weight is partially based on the age of the dam at the time of birth. You can see that that comes into play here. And so again, that's why it's important to try and have at least an estimated birth date for your cows. If I go down a little bit further, we get to the weight ratios. And once again, it's reminding us that it has to do with the dam's weight as well, and that you need to have a dam weight within 400 days, or it may not work properly for you. So let's just come down. All of the calculations that are in the dashboards or behind the scenes in the dashboards are listed here as well. Let me just go through a couple of these to give you an idea of why it's important to understand what's going on here. So all births in year is kind of an internal calculation that's used as the basis of a lot of the other dashboard calculations. So how is it defined? Well, any birth that was recorded in a given year is the easy definition, but what does that actually mean? Well, this is what it actually means. It's where the calving year, remember every calf has a birth date, but also a calving year field. So any calf born this year, the calving year field should be set to 2019. And so the first thing Hurley does is actually look at the calving year to see if it's equal to whatever year we care about at the time, 2019 maybe in our case. And the calving year, if you had a calf that was born a little bit early, maybe December 30th, for example, you probably still want that to be part of the 2019 calving year. And so as long as the calving year is set to the correct year, even if their birth date is in a different calendar year, it'll still be included as part of that calving group. And so that's important. It is possible to leave the calving year at 0. We don't recommend that, but if it is, then Hurley will actually look at just the calendar year of the birth date to include it. And finally, for a calf to be included in this number here, the arrival type for the calf must be set to raised. And that's to distinguish between animals that were born in a certain year, but were purchased and not actually born on your ranch. And so you can see if your dashboards aren't working quite right, going here and looking at some of this may give you some clues as to what may be wrong in the underlying data. Let's just look at the next one for a moment. All heifer births in year. Again, this is an internal calculation that's used as the basis of a lot of other formulas that are set up for the dashboards. This is very similar to all births in year, but we're trying to restrict it to just the heifers that were calving in that year. So how do we decide in Herdley if an animal is a heifer on that particular year? Well, it's described here. An animal is considered a heifer at the time of a calf's birth if the following is true. The calving number, so we keep track in Herdley of the calving number. So the first year an animal has a calf, that'll be calving number 1, whether it's twins or not, doesn't matter. It's still calving year number 1. Second time it's calving number 2, and so on each year. And we can't rely solely on calving number, because if Herdley only knows about an animal, you know, let's say you purchased an animal that's 5 years old, or you just started using Herdley when an animal is 5 years old and you haven't put in the calves from previous years, which would be common, then Herdley's going to think that the first calf it knows about is calving number 1. So that gives us a clue, but not the whole story. So it also will look at the birth date for both the calf and the dam, and it checks to see if the dam is less than 2.5 years old, 900 days to be exact. And so if, for example, you don't have a birth date for the dam, the heifer in this case, it's not going to be considered a heifer. Herdley can't work out that it's a heifer, can't know that for sure, and so it just assumes that it's a cow. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how some of that works. I'm just going to go down a little bit further to this one here, first calving date for heifers. Just to show how Herdley tries to work out when you're working on the calving, when it's working on the calving distribution. In order to find out each 21-day cycle during the calving cycle, or sorry, during the calving year, it needs to know when the first calving cycle starts. And so there's a few ways it can do that. And in fact, the first thing it'll do was it'll look in the ranch settings window at the exposure dates. And I'm going to just click back to Herdley and show you where this is. So if I click Setup here and go to ranch settings, and if I drop down to the exposure date section, there's a place here where optionally I can tell Herdley that for a specific year, these were the dates both for heifers and for the main herd for the first exposure date. And so I can basically force Herdley to use a certain date. And if I use a certain date here for the exposure date, then the first calving date is going to be, you know, the 283 days later into the next year, and it just works that out. So let's go back to the documentation. So if you've entered in a value there, then Herdley will use that date, and that will be for sure what it uses. But it goes on to explain that if that date isn't given, then the next thing Herdley does is it tries to find any exposure or mating records from the previous year for any heifers that are calving this year. And if it can find any, then it takes the earliest one, adds 283 days, and says, okay, this is the first calving date in this year for, the first cycle for heifers. And then it works out the rest of the 21-day cycles from there. If it can't find any exposure or mating records in the previous year, then it's just going to look at all the heifers that calved in this year. It's going to take the earliest one, and it's going to say, this is when the first calving happened. This is the beginning of our first cycle, and work things out from there. So you can get an idea of how Herdley's thinking behind the scenes. And so if we were to go down further and look at our dashboards, one of our dashboards here is calving distribution. And again, this explains exactly how that calving distribution works. It uses some of the values we were just talking about, so it knows what date to start with, and then basically adds 21 days for each calving cycle. But note here that it's explaining that the first cycle, the first 21 days, actually will include calves that were born before day one. And so if you have your dates set up in such a way that maybe an extra calf that was born early for some reason isn't part of that first cycle, it actually does get included in the first cycle and then goes from there. So hopefully the documentation can be helpful. It's a lot of documentation to go through and probably not exactly nighttime reading, but when you do have a question or if something's not quite working the way you're expecting in Herdley, especially in the dashboards, this is a great place to go get acquainted with how things work. Okay, let me put the documentation away and we'll get back to Herdley. I'm going to cancel the ranch settings window, move back to the animal list. And the reason I wanted to go through that from the move animals action was to explain how it figures out what cows would be affected. And we learned from there that it's only going to understand it as a cow that could possibly be exposed if there's certain criteria that are met. All right, let me cancel this action. Well, there's lots of other actions. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail in this webinar, but they are all documented and I think fairly self-explanatory in most cases. What I'd like to do now is hop over to the dashboards for a moment because we have been talking about them. And I'm not going to go through all of the dashboards either. There's a lot that are available. But just want to show two different things about how dashboards work on the computer. The first is that if you want, you can double-click any dashboard. And if you do, then it's going to open up that dashboard in a bigger window so you have more access to seeing exactly what it is. This can be especially helpful if you're showing more than 4 years or a lot of data, or you just really want to zoom in and see what's going on. And then we just close the window. Another thing we can do with dashboards is I can go up to the dashboard button and choose Customize Dashboard. And there's two sections to this customization window. One is for the ranch values. And so on the right-hand side, I see which dashboards I'm currently looking at. And on the left is all the possible ones that I could see. So for example, breeding pool females is something I don't currently have. If I double click that and added it here and save this, then if we scroll to the bottom of the ranch values part, we see that the breeding pool females, this gives us now a count of how many females that are current and are in the breeding pool, how many exist. So that's how that works. Moving on, if we go to the ranch metrics section, We can change how many years are showing in each of the dashboards here, as well as add items in a similar way. So there's lots of possible items. We could add those, do whatever we wanted with them. On this side, if we wanted to get rid of them, we could double click or drag and drop to get rid of them as well. So that's how you can customize your dashboard. I'm just going to cancel out of that. Okay, let's go back to the animal list for a moment. And I want to just talk about child lists for a few minutes. This is also an important part of Herdly, one of the fundamental concepts that you'll use on the computer. Child lists are only available on computers. But let's show you how they can be opened. So I'm going to choose a cow here. I'm going to go up and click Child List, and this gives me an option of all the possible child lists that can be opened. Let's say I want to see this cow's calves. So I'll choose Show Calves, and the screen gets split. So in the top, I can still see all my list of animals, but now at the bottom, I have this child list. And this is showing, so I've got 101A selected up here, so that means I'm seeing all of her calves down here. Now if I chose a different cow at the top, you'll see that at the bottom, we're now seeing her calves. One thing that's interesting about child lists is I can actually select more than one animal up here, and I'll see the combined results down here. So if I select both of those cows that we had before, now I'm seeing the calves for both of those put together. Now if I wanted, I could put my mouse here in the center between the two lists, and I can drag to change the height. So sometimes you want to see more of one list or more of the other. That can be handy. Importantly, when you have a child list open, you have all the same buttons down here as you had up here. And so, for example, we could add a filter. Now notice that we have a bunch of calves showing from different calving years. What if we just wanted to see the calves from this year? Well, let's go and click our filter button. And we'll go down here. We have a common filter for calving year, and let's just change that to 2019. And I'll click Apply Filter. And now only the calves from 2019 are showing. And that continues to be true. If I were to choose a different cow, you can see this cow has no calves from 2019. And I think there's only 4 cows in this herd right now that have even calved in 2019. But if we select any of those particular ones, you'll see just those calves. This one obviously had twins. Similarly, we can click on the little view button just for the child list, and we can decide which fields are showing. Maybe we want to add tag color, so we can see that for the calves. I'll click OK here, and now the tag color column is added here as well. And there can be actions you can perform on different records that are in the child list, or you can print or do the other things here too. When you're ready to get, when you're finished with the child list, you can click this button over here to hide it, and it goes away. Let me just show you a couple of other child lists. I want to show the drug events child list, because I think this gives a good example of how you edit. There is already an action. If we go up to the main list actions button, there's an action to create a new drug event. But what happens if you need to edit that because you made a mistake? Well, the way to do that is to open up the drug events child list, and now you have access to all the drug events from this animal. And if I were to select one and then click on the actions button, one of my options is going to be to edit the drug event. And so I could edit it. I could make whatever changes I wanted to make, and then save that, and that would be saved at that point. One thing that's helpful to know is that the child list and its filter and its columns that it's showing, everything about the child list is also considered to be part of the workspace. And so you remember we talked earlier about workspaces. If I needed to set this up as a particular workspace, I could save that. I'll just call this test because I can't think of a better name right now, and I'm going to save that. Now later on, let's say that we're back here just working with our regular workspace, but we need to get back to that situation where we're seeing the drugs maybe listed in a certain order or with a certain query. All we have to do is click on Workspace, find our workspace name, which was test in this case. We can double click it, and instantly everything comes back just as it was before. So another handy use for workspaces. Important to know that they work with child lists. Okay, I'm going to close this child list, and I want to move on and talk about printing. To print from the animal list window, we click the print button here, and it's going to ask us some details about our printer. I'm going to ask not to actually print to the printer, but to open in preview for me. And then it asks a little bit more here. Now, what it's going to actually do is it's going to print exactly what columns you have showing at this moment and what records you have showing and in what order they're showing. So we just cancel this. And so you can see in this case, we would have tagged and status and gender and so on. And you'll see that I only have one animal selected. I'm just going to go ahead and select a range here just as an example. And I'm going to go back and click print. Again, I'm going to choose preview. And at the top, I have the choice. Do I want to print just the 8 selected records or the 148 displayed records? Well, in this case, I just want the ones I have selected, so I'm going to leave that. I could change the report title to give it something a little bit more meaningful. And if I need to play with the margins or change the orientation or the font size, I can do all of that here. Importantly, at the bottom, Herdley is pre-calculating the width that the columns you have showing in the list behind this window are going to take when it actually prints on paper. So right now it's saying that 91% of the table will fit inside the margins. So we have a left and right margin of 3/4 of an inch, and so some of that is going to fall outside of that. And so from that we could make some changes. Maybe we want to change the orientation to landscape. Now it's letting us know, yep, okay, everything will fit. And this helps you get that prepared. So if I were to click print, then it's going to show in preview. You can see it's changed to landscape. And these are exactly the animals we had selected in that order with the same columns. So that's how printing works. So going back to workspaces again, if you have a certain report with certain columns in a certain order that you want to print, maybe a filtered. We talked earlier about having cows or showing just the cows that have not calved, for example. Maybe you want a list of those. Remember that all you can have to do is create a workspace that's going to print exactly the way you want to. And then whenever you want to print that report, just use that workspace and then print, and you'll be ready to go. Now, sometimes you may want to get data out of Herdley into some other program, a spreadsheet, for example. And I'll show you how that works. Again, same concept. You want to make sure you're showing the columns that you want to export. Whatever you have showing here is what's actually going to get exported. And whatever you have showing as far as which animals are showing will be what's exported in that order. So again, I'll just say that I have these 8 animals. I want to export exactly what's here. I'll click the export button. And then we have several options. The first thing I need to choose is what kind of an export do I want? Do I want to just copy it to the clipboard, which is typically the thing you want to do if you're trying to get it into a spreadsheet. It's very quick and easy. You can also send it out to a file, different kinds of files. We support comma-separated value or CSV files, tab delimited, XML, and even JSON files. In our example, we're just going to copy to the clipboard because that's a quick way to get it into a spreadsheet. And at the bottom, I can choose, again, do I want to export just the 8 selected records, or do I want to export all of the ones that currently are displayed in this list? So if I click Export, Copy to Clipboard, it just does it. It's now in the system's clipboard. And if I open up a spreadsheet, I have one here on my computer called Numbers. I'm just going to put choose the top left cell. And if I go to Edit and choose Paste, it's going to take what's in the clipboard that was from Herdley and paste it into the spreadsheet. And so you can see now I have all of that information thrown in here, and I could manipulate it however I wanted from there. And I'm going to just hide the spreadsheet and go back to Herdley. Now, I'd like to switch to the phone for a moment. So let me just get switched over so you can see that as well. Okay, hopefully now you can see Herdley on the phone again. I'm currently looking at the dashboards. What I want to show right now is how you can edit things in Herdley that on the desktop you could only edit through a child list. For example, I showed earlier how to edit a drug event. How would you do that on the phone when there aren't child lists on the phone? Well, I'll show you how to do that. Let's go to the animals list, and then I'm going to choose an animal. I'll just choose that cow that we chose before. And if I tap the eye icon or the info icon that's to the right of each animal, to the right of 101A in this case, Herdley builds a history of that animal showing all kinds of information about her. And if I were to scroll down, I could see all kinds of things about her. I want to go down to the drug events. And so I'm actually going to tap the events button at the top rather than trying to scroll all the way. And then I'm going to tap health events. And it scrolls automatically to any diagnoses, any drug events, anything related with their health. Importantly, you'll notice that to the left of each one of these events is a pencil icon. And this is to indicate that that can be edited. So in the other drug events area, there's a drug event from January 31st. And I'm going to tap the pencil icon, and you'll see that it brings up the information for that drug event. I could make whatever changes I wanted to here, and then I could tap save, and that drug event would be saved, and then we're back to seeing that history. And then if I'm done with the history, I can tap the back button, and now I'm back to the list. Okay, we just have one more thing to go over, and for that I'm going to switch back to the computer. So let me do that so you can see the computer screen again. Okay, hopefully you can see that. The last thing I wanted to go over in this webinar, and definitely there's a lot of other fundamental pieces of Herdley we could go over, but just one more I'd like to go over in this particular one that I think will be helpful, and this has to do with CCIA events. Now, in a previous webinar, I showed how to set up your CCIA account. And I'm just going to go back to that section for a moment. If I click on Setup in the dashboard, choose Ranch Settings, you'll see that near the bottom, the second last section is the CCIA section. And I won't go over all this setup, but I just want to point out that I have automatically create CCIA events checked. I have my account information here. But notice that for my locations, I don't have my premise IDs associated with the locations. I should, but I don't in this case. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to cancel out of that. And we're going to try moving an animal. So let's just choose a random animal here. We've got a calf here. I'm going to click on Actions. I'm going to move the animal. And let's say I want to move it to section 11. Now notice when I click Save, it does save the move properly, but this little window at the top right of the screen shows up, and it's giving me some information about the CCIA events that it tried to create. Because back in the ranch settings window, I had the checkbox checked to automatically create CCIA events. When the move event happened, it wanted to create a CCIA move event. However, it wasn't able to, and so it gives us this little yellow background letting us know that, hey, I tried to do something, but there was a problem with it. And it's telling us that there was 0 moving events created and 1 failed to be created. Sometimes if you're moving several animals at once, some of them will work, some of them won't. But if we want to find out why, we can click this View Failure Reasons button. If not, we could dismiss it. But let's click that and see what it tells us. And predictably, it's telling us that for this animal, 105F, a premise ID isn't associated with the location. So if I were to go back into my settings and then enter in the correct premise ID for the new location I was trying to send the animal to and tried it again, then this would work properly. So if you're using CCIA events and they aren't working for some reason, make sure you're checking that out and you can see why they're failing. You can see that on the phone as well. Now let me create a calf to show how that works. I'm going to choose this cow here. I don't think I've created a calf for her this year yet. So I'll click on Actions and choose New Calf. Now there's lots of things I could enter, but I just want to show the CCIA related part of that. And so I'm going to just leave all the rest of the fields other than I am going to enter in a tag number. So that's an RFID tag. This is just a fake example, so I'm going to use that number there. Now I'm going to click Save, and I just want you to pay attention to this top right-hand corner. There's going to be a window that flashes for just a couple of seconds, and then it'll go away. But you'll see that there's a green bar in it, and it's to indicate that an event was created. So let me click Save, and you can see one birth date event was created, and after a couple of seconds, it automatically goes away. And that's just a visual indicator to you so that you kind of have an idea of what's going on behind the scenes. This calf was created. A birth date event for CCIA was created as well. Now, if we didn't have the RFID number, it wouldn't have been able to do that. But because we did, it was able to do that. So then, as you go about creating CCIA events, or rather going about doing your regular things and then having Hurley create those in the background, what do you do with them then? And to show you that, I want to go back to the dashboard. And you'll see here that there's a CCIA events button. And it actually has a badge on here telling us that right now there are 2 CCIA events that have not yet been submitted to CCIA. And one of those would have been that calf we just created. So if I click on that button, it opens up the CCIA events window. And the first thing it shows is all the events that have been created and are ready to be submitted to CCIA but haven't yet been submitted. And there's several things I can do with this window. I can double check and see if the information here is correct. Do I actually want to send this information? If I double click one of these, it brings up some of the raw information behind so I can see what's really being sent. This is the one that was just created a moment ago. I can see that it's a birth date type event. I can see what the RFID number is, what the birth date is, and more information there. I'll just click the Done button to go back. The important thing to know is that what you will normally do is just select one of these events, hit Control-A or Command-A, depending on whether you're on Windows or Macintosh, to select all the events that are ready to be submitted, and then click the Submit to CCIA button. I'm not actually going to submit them to CCIA because I just have some fake data there. But if you did that, then immediately Hurley goes to work in the background, communicating with CCIA, and over a period of time, usually within about 15 minutes, it will submit those events to CCIA. And then not only does it submit them, but it waits and it checks back with CCIA a little bit later, 5, 10, 15 minutes later, to see if the submission actually went through. And if there was any errors that happened while CCIA was working through those events, Herdly will find that out and then actually let you know. And if there are any, back in the dashboard, there'll be another badge right here that shows in red how many CCIA events have some kind of problem. And that saves you from having to remember to go to their website and check things over to see if those events were processed correctly. At the top of the CCIA events window, we have this status pop up. When you submit, or rather a CCIA event can be in several states while it's in Herdly. We've already talked about the one where it's ready for you to submit. That means it's just waiting for you to click the submit button. Immediately after you submit it, it would go into the awaiting Herdly state, which means it's waiting for Herdly to do some processing in the background. Again, that usually only takes a few minutes. After that, it goes into an awaiting for CCIA, and that's when Herdly's waiting for CCIA to work on that event and eventually let us know whether or not it worked. Hopefully, this is the best case scenario. Everything worked fine, all the data was correct, and CCIA was happy with it. The event will then go into the complete stage. If it doesn't, there are two places it can go. It can go into a user error state, which means that there's something that was wrong, but it's usually something you can correct quite easily. So for example, maybe your password wasn't entered incorrectly, and so you just need to change and fix your password. Maybe your premise ID was not entered correctly. You just need to change your premise ID, then you can resubmit these and everything goes through fine. Sometimes you'll get a final error, and the final error means that Herdly can't do anything more automatically with this, but there was an error where CCIA rejected this submission. For example, I've seen some RFID tags that are typed in incorrectly, and it's an RFID that just simply doesn't exist. And so that'll be a final error, and that needs to be corrected manually at that point, which can still be done in Herdly. So if I choose any of these other statuses, for example, I can click complete. If I had any completed CCIA events from in the past, it would show there. I don't know if I have any at all, actually, probably not, because this is just a demo ranch, but it would show the different kinds of events here. Furthermore, if I wanted to restrict to a certain type of CCIA event, because I'm trying to find something in particular, I could do that here. And I don't have any good examples of this, so I'll just leave that for now. Okay, so that helps us with the CCIA events. Hopefully that's helpful to you. Just before we quit this webinar, I just want to remind you that in most of the windows, and this is true on the phone as well as on the computer, you'll find a help button somewhere. And if you ever click that help button, it automatically opens up. There we go. Automatically opens up the page that has to do with exactly what you're looking for. And so that's helpful. And in addition, if you go to the support section of our website and scroll down, you can see we have everything documented in Herdly. If there's something you still need help with and can't find there, you can always click the request support button and fill in a bit of information, and we try and get back to you within about 24 hours so that we can help you. Finally, I just want to point out that if you click on the webinars link and scroll down, you can see our past webinars here. Those can be helpful if you haven't seen them already. And this webinar that we're currently recording will be added to this list in the next day or two. So with that, just want to remind you that we do have a final webinar coming up in 2 weeks. If you wanted to sign up for that on our website, you can and be part of it. It's going to be kind of a fun one where we're basically going to go through and show a lot of tips and tricks with Herdly that make it so you can be a bit more of an expert with it and be more efficient with that. Also, want to let you know that we are open for additional webinars in the future. We're looking for ideas for what we might cover. So if you have something you're interested in, please let us know. We're happy to make a webinar that's short or long or whatever meets your needs. We want to thank you for using Herdly. We appreciate that. We're trying to spread the word about Herdly so more people know about it, can use it, and so we encourage you to talk to neighbors and friends and let them know you're using it where possible. So thank you. We appreciate it. Appreciate your time.